Welcome to the History of North America. I'm Mark Vinette. In 1621, the Virginia Company of London recruited young women to become wives for the planters in its new colony in Jamestown. They were to be sold into marriage, generating a profit for investors and helping ensure the colony's long-term viability. But who were the English women who made the Atlantic crossing, and what happened to them when they arrived? Let's learn more about this fascinating part of colonial history as told by the Not Just the Tudors podcast.
We're tracing the lives of English women recruited as brides for planters in Jamestown in the colony of Virginia.
Now, the Virginia Company was always optimistic, and it said that divers of the women were married before the ships left Jamestown again. Divers is one of those words that can mean a few and it can mean many. We don't know how many. I think it's pretty clear that most of the women will not have found a husband straight away. I think the authorities in Jamestown would have summoned to Jamestown likely husbands, i.e. husbands who actually had the cash to pay for them. Jamestown Island itself is too small to have accommodated all the women because one of the stipulations from the company was that until they got married, they had to be housed in households where there was a wife, because you couldn't just let them loose in this wild society. So they were dispersed to settlements around the James River because by then the colony was growing slowly. And we know that some of them definitely did marry, although it is really tricky trying to find out what happened to women in the colony because women changed their surname when they married, and most of the early records of Virginia were burnt in the Civil War. So although there would have been registers of births, marriages and deaths, all those have gone. We have to rely on censuses, and it is very tricky tracking what happened to women with common first names. More than half the 56 women I looked at were called either Elizabeth, Anne, Alice or Mary.
In 1622, just weeks after their arrival, tragedy struck. Can you tell me what happened?
Yes, 22nd of March, 1622. The day began as normal with Native Americans coming into the settlements as usual. Then what happened was, it's now called the Great Indian Attack. It was a concerted attempt by Opechancanough, who was then the leader of the Algonquin-speaking tribes, to drive the English out of Virginia. And early in the morning, the attack happened, and between a third and a quarter of the English colony was wiped out. Men, women and children, including a lot of the women. There were lists of the living and the dead after the attack. The English were taken completely by surprise. They were slaughtered, often with their own tools. And there have been archaeological digs that have revealed what happened to some of the bodies. There were eyewitness descriptions of really terrible things happening during the slaughter. And one of the settlements that was worst hit was Martin's Hundred, which is where one of the Jamestown brides, whose story I look at in some detail, a young woman called Anne Jackson, who was going to join her brother, who was a bricklayer actually in the Martin's Hundred, and she had travelled out on the Marmaduke, and she must have felt more confident than a lot of the other brides because she wasn't quite going into the unknown. She was going to join family who would presumably help her find a husband. And it was thought she was killed during the Great Indian Attack. But just under 7 years later, she suddenly turns up in the records again. She hadn't been killed. She had been taken captive by the Pamunkey Indian tribe. It's not clear if she was held captive for the whole 6 years. I think she probably was. About 15 English women from the whole of the colony were taken prisoner, and 4 men. Now, the men were put to death. This is the men in captivity. At least 1 or 2, probably more, were returned within about a year. But I think Anne was a captive for very much longer. And she suddenly appears in the court records for Jamestown, where it says that in January 1629, Anne Jackson, which came from the Indians. To me, that suggests she's recently been returned from the Indians, that her brother should look after her until she can be sent back to England. And if you think of the number of culture shocks she's gone through, she's left Westminster, she's travelled across the Atlantic, she's come to this Martin's Hundred, this bustling new settlement on the James River. Then she'd gone through the trauma of the Indian attack. Then, having already had to get used to life in the wilderness of the colony, she then had to get used to life living with the Native Americans. And as the months and the years wore on, she would have had to lose her very modest dress, and she would have had no option but to adopt Indian dress. And she'd have to get used to washing in cold water. The English really didn't wash much then, if at all. The Indians considered the English were really rather smelly. But just to try and imagine, women captives, they were not raped, but they were worked very hard. They were worked as slave labour. And the idea was that they would eventually be ransomed. Whether or not a ransom was paid for her, we don't know. But it is quite possible, this is speculative, that her 6 or 7 years with the Indians, she discovered that the relationships between Native American men and women were very much kinder and gentler than the kind of relationships between men and women in Jacobean Virginia, where women were the property of men and they did what they were told. They obeyed their fathers, their brothers, and relations were very different between the two societies. And then she suddenly returned to the loud, quarrelsome English and is sent back to England. I was unable to say if she ever got here or how long she lived, because although I looked in all the records, the name Anne Jackson is a common one. I found several Anne Jacksons who died in Westminster, which I imagine is where she went back to.
Now, there were 3 other women that you managed to trace in some depth beyond Anne Jackson: Catherine Finch, Audrey Hoare and Bridget Croft. I feel sure that it's because they weren't called Elizabeth or Anne. Could you tell us perhaps about one of these women? Because they seem to have been rather extraordinary. They adapted and they prospered and showed great spirit.
Yes, I have enormous admiration for them. Let me take Catherine Finch. She's the sister of the crossbow maker to the king, and she's an orphan by the time she leaves for Virginia. She has 3 brothers in England. 2 of them are crossbow makers, and the other is a goldsmith. And all 3 brothers take her to the Virginia Company. Now, whether they wanted to get rid of her or what, I don't know, but she's handed over to the Virginia Company and she marries a carpenter. He's called Robert Fisher. He was what was called an ancient planter, which means that he'd arrived in the colony before 1616. In fact, Robert arrived back in 1611, and we don't know exactly where they were at the time of the Great Indian Attack. But pretty soon after, in 1624 and 1625, they are living in a settlement called Jordan's Journey. She was living with Robert. Now, Robert was a skilled carpenter. Before the Indian attack, he had actually been commissioned by a man called George Thorpe to construct a house for Opachancanouugh. He's the man who led the Indian attack, and Robert Fisher constructs the house. Opachancanouugh is said to have been so delighted with the house, especially with its lock and key, that he would let himself into and out of his house 100 times a day. We know that in early 1625, Robert and Catherine are living in this very small community. There are just 15 households at Jordan's Journey where they're living. They have a daughter called Cicely, There's a maidservant, and they're reasonably well provisioned because this is the crucial censo, it was called a muster, which gave the names, including the Christian names of settlers, so including the women. And it also listed what ship they came by and the year. And it recorded their wealth in a way, how many houses they had, what sort of armour they had, because the English settlers took their coats of armour and chainmail and helmets with them to Virginia, and foodstuffs. So husband Robert, Catherine and daughter Cicely, I reckon they were about number 4 in the pecking order of households. So she's done really well for herself. She landed with nothing. Then the really sad thing is that from 1625, they just disappear from the records. There's no land claim. It's possible they moved elsewhere, but you had to get permission to move away from the colony. And I suspect they simply succumbed to illness. A partially good story. Another of the women was called Audrey Hall. She was a shoemaker's daughter from Aylesbury. She goes over and she marries someone called Captain Thomas Harris. He was an ancient planter. He arrived not as a gentleman, but he was one of those really thrusting, successful men who ended up among Virginia's elite. Over in Virginia, she was known as Adria, so she becomes Adria Harris. She had a daughter and then a son called William, and I met one of William's direct descendants. We had coffee at the British Library, and she's called Virginia. I asked her if she felt very proud to be connected to the women, and she said that's not really how she looks on it, but being connected to one of the very early settlers did give her a real sense of belonging, and of belonging to 2 cultures as well. And it is extraordinary when you go over to Virginia, people know who they are related to, people who have descended from the original settlers. And there is the Jamestown Society that has very strict membership rules, and a criterion for membership is that your ancestors must have arrived before 1625. That entitles you to belong to the society.
Do you think the Jamestown brides were victims of a patriarchal society, or were they adventurers willing to risk their lives in expanding their horizons?
The answer has to lie somewhere in between. I remember being completely shocked that the Virginia Company and officials and investors never expressed a tiny bit of regret at sending so many of these women over to their deaths. And remember Cicely Bray, the relative of Sir Edwin Sandys, she was slaughtered in the Great Indian Attack. She died at a settlement called Powell Brook. I think the company was not entirely honest in the way they painted Virginia as a place to go. They wanted the colony to thrive. They wanted good women to go there. So in that sense, I think a lot of the women would have been persuaded to go without the real facts. But then you come across those who survived and put down roots and did really well at a time when back in England, it was often very hard to find a husband. And I remember giving a talk in Jamestown to what used to be called the Virginia Historical Society, and ending up by saying that I look on these women, they have every right to be called the founding mothers of America. We hear about the founding fathers, but some of these really are the founding mothers, although I suspect not many of them survived long enough. But I look on them with huge admiration.
I'm Mark Vinet, and I hope you're enjoying the ride.